Hi, Vanessa.
Hey, Adam.
Welcome to Uncertain Things. Today we have Robby Soave, right? Did I pronounce it right?
Is that how we pronounce it?
That is how you pronounce it.
Yes, I got it right. Who's the senior editor at Reason Magazine.
Hi, guys.
It's been something that I've been thinking about for a while, that I'd love to do our pre-election coverage through the libertarian lens, just because there's something both about Reason specifically, but I think libertarians in general, that kind of show intolerance to the BS on both sides, and has a more cleansing effect to judge politics through. So I thought it'd be great to talk to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree. We do sometimes, to some degree, I think libertarians find ourselves in a moderator role, or a we abhor both sides so much, and increasingly over time, it's not like either side moves closer to our position. So I think I'm able, and many of my compatriots are able to somewhat fairly, you know what our biases is, because we telegraph them, and we're very loud about what we think.
Which is actually going straight to my first question. Yeah, you've just literally telegraphed who you guys on Reason Magazine are voting for, right?
That's right. We released a voluntary list. Anyone on staff can participate if they want to. They don't have to. Where every person explains who they're voting for and why. We've done this in many election cycles. We've done this in I don't know how many, probably 4 or 5 election cycles at least. Our thinking is that, journalists do have biases, and it might be better if they just admit that. Particularly, so we're opinion journalists anyway, and that's pretty out there. You're supposed to know that we're coming from a perspective, and our perspective informs our writing, and you should take that into consideration when you read us. So we had a lot of people participate. It was not surprising results. Most people who are voting, who work for Reason, are voting for the Libertarian candidate, Jo Jorgensen. There's also a healthy number of non-voters for both principled reasons and for, I don't know where I'm registered to vote reasons. And then of some interest, there were a couple votes for Biden and 1 or 2 votes for Trump.
Interesting mix there.
Do you think this logic applies, or should apply, to places like the New York Times, Washington Post? Do you think that they're missing something by not having this policy?
I think opinion magazines, for certain, are well served by participating in this. I saw the American Conservative did a similar thing, mostly votes for Trump, and not everyone actually said who they were voting for. With straight news outlets, it's tricky, but I think I'm trying to understand what the downside would be if they just did it, because most people do assume correctly that they do have biases. One of the things that social media has kind of, I think, brought to the forefront is that the people doing, straight, quote unquote, straight news do have strong views. And that's not nefarious. Everyone has strong views. It's very hard to be totally dispassionate. I mean, it's borderline. You almost lack knowledge if you're so dispassionate that you have no priors whatsoever. But social media has allowed a lot of straight news reporters to sometimes let their biases float out there a little more freely, because what they're saying there isn't carefully edited by someone else, by an editor. So often I see more kind of rushing to one side of a story or another on a reporter's Twitter feed. So, in answer to your question, I think it's an intriguing idea, and that might have more upside than people think.
So, from your perspective, there wasn't it wasn't like a moral conundrum for you to do this. Like, I don't know which journalism schools you went to or what shaped your thinking, but it wasn't like you felt some sort of internal tension there.
No. I want to give my readers, people who follow my work, more information about what I'm thinking. I don't see how it could serve them poorly, how it could serve them well to it's, at least in my case. In other cases, it could certainly be debatable. In my case, I don't see how it serves my readers well to keep that information from them.
But you write about the media a lot, and or at least what you see as follies in media coverage, and the behavior of maybe like blue check mark reporters.
Yeah.
So before we get into what you diagnose as some of those follies, do you think that this is something that could actually help in terms of improving public perceptions about the media? Exactly like you said, if everybody is expecting that they're already biased, being honest about it could make it better. Won't it just make it worse? Won't it make the siloing even more severe? And just like, now we're just honest that, kind of like British journalism, that you know where everybody is, and it's just two opposing forces fighting each other, not really any attempt at a consensus or a mediative, objective reportage.
Yeah, I don't know. You could be right. It already, though, sort of feels like everyone is in one camp or another, especially during the Trump years, because Trump himself sort of positioned himself as the anti-media tribe. And many in the media have gone along with that. In some places, it was difficult not to do that. Trump made the refs the other team. So there has been such which is difficult for me. It's difficult for people who have not necessarily moderate views, but views that don't fit neatly into one category or another, or some views that overlap strongly with one category and some views that overlap strongly with the other category. Everything about the Trump years wants you to commit to a side, commit to a team, with the media being very much part of the non-Trump team. So I think, and I don't think this for certain, but it could actually. I think some people have a. It's like there's a secret being kept from them. That the media are still pretending that they're these neutral gatekeepers. So if they just admitted it, it's possible some people would be less inflamed about their coverage of certain things. And actually, for a real test of this, often it's, even in Trump world, it's CNN getting attacked rather than MSNBC, even though MSNBC is obviously more progressive in its outlook, much more consistently liberal in its outlook. But it annoys a kind of large swath of the country of Trump people, because CNN is supposed to be unbiased, but they're not. They don't expect the same from MSNBC.
To belabor the point just for one more second, I'm just wondering, is the problem there, though, that they're not honest about their bias, or that they are failing to even try to live up to their pretense as objective journalism?
There's a lot of different issues here, right? Because even the issue of even saying the media is biased is this broad statement that doesn't get into the weeds of how this bias actually functions.
Right.
Because you have, one of the most sort of important under scrutinized or under considered elements of a media bias is just in deciding what to write about in the first place, or what's important enough to write about. But you can be objective without being unbiased. None of us are really unbiased. But journalists still have to be objective when they consider. So if a piece of information, new information development really, really, really confirms what you already think, then you need to be like even more scrutinizing, even more investigative to make sure you're just not like telling yourself what you want to hear. And many of the recent media controversies for the last few years have taken place in a context of journalists just confirming, what they already think about Trump people or et cetera, in a very lazy way, and that blowing up in their faces.
Right, which is kind of part of the way that you've kind of started to gain recognition, I suppose. And this is kind of like your niche, is pointing these instances out when they happen. I mean, would you mind talking a little bit about maybe one that sticks out in your mind that you think is a particularly good example of the times where the media has just not done its due diligence?
Sure. I think I fair to state I became best known for covering the Covington Catholic school incident, the boys on the Lincoln Memorial who were accused of racially harassing this Native American man and his entourage who had approached them. And it was initially, there was this viral clip of the man seemingly being bullied by these kids. One in particular, Nick Sandman. Again, these are Catholic high school students. It is a short video clip where it looks like he's really standing in the Native American man's way, and he's giving him this really uncomfortable, really bullying stare. And it went viral, and news stories are appearing about it everywhere. It's CNN.com, the Washington Post, other outlets. And then, so I was one of the first people, when I sat down to write about the story, a longer video had just appeared on the internet. So I watched that one first, and that one showed that there was a great deal of additional context to this, that actually the boys had been screamed at by this kind of crazy group, the Black Hebrew Israelites. It's like a black nationalist cult. I've had unpleasant run-ins with them on the streets of DC before. They just yell crazy things at people. And that had been going on for an hour, and the boys hadn't really done anything objectionable in response to them. Then the Native American man and his group appear on the scene, and it's like they took the side of the Black Hebrew Israelites, and they really wandered into their midst. And Sandman, the starer, is not actually in his way, and it's just totally different context. Not an example of like these kids descending on like this innocent group of people and harassing them. So I wrote that, and then really, additional information did come out pretty swiftly that it was portrayed wrongly, and it became this whole media debacle. I think almost everyone's heard of it by now, leading even to lawsuits against CNN, the Washington Post, and others. I think both of those have been settled for undisclosed sums.
Yeah, that was an interesting moment.
Yeah.
Okay, enough media navel gazing.
Yeah.
Before we get into your book, I still want to ask you about the election. So you mentioned in the little blurb you wrote describing why you're voting for Joe. Is it Jorgensen or Jorgensen?
Jorgensen, I believe.
Jorgensen.
Yeah.
You mentioned there that you would have voted for Biden had he picked Tulsi Gabbard as his VP. I'm just thinking what your thinking there was, and also how do you see the stakes for the upcoming elections?
Sure. I mean, I'm a libertarian pretty down the line. I want the Libertarian Party to do well. I have no illusions that she's going to be elected. It's important for me for the Libertarian Party to have a higher raw total number of votes, so that they just have more access to election resources in the future. I'm also voting in DC, so my vote absolutely does not matter. I don't think, to me, there's a lot I really don't like about both Biden and Trump. I think Trump is appalling. So if you made me choose, he should not be the president again. So that would leave Biden. But I'm not voting for either of them because I find Biden inadequate in so many ways as well. I want to be pandered to a little bit. If you want my vote and you're not the Libertarian Party, you need to say that I value you and I want to bring you into my coalition. So I thought to myself, how could Biden realistically do that? So if he had chosen a VP who was a little bit more independent-minded, obviously he's not going to choose like an out-and-out libertarian, but a Democrat with some appeal to non-Democrats who has discussed some of the things that are important to libertarians. And I thought, Tulsi Gabbard was, again, this was never going to happen, but was at least another person who had run for president, was a woman, checked some of the diversity boxes he said were important to choosing. So that was kind of my, if you did that, you would communicate to me that you really are interested in independent voters. Tulsi was someone who talked about some libertarian issues, certainly not a libertarian, certainly many things I disagree with her on. But that was my thinking there. Now, at no point did I think that was a good electoral strategy for Joe Biden. I'm not saying courting my vote is a winning strategy, but if he had done that, I would have likely voted for him, yes.
I'm interested because I don't need any convincing, but I do wonder what makes him appalling to you.
I think that his bullying behavior, his lack of presidential fit. I mean, everything you'll hear from people who don't like Trump are things I don't like about Trump. I mean, he also doesn't care about so many of the things he claims to care about. I mean, the size of government continues to get worse. The debt continues to get worse. If I were to he's terrible on trade and immigration. So both issues where he is worse than a normal Republican would be. I think on most issues he is worse than a normal Republican would be. If I were to make an affirmative case for Trump, it would rest for me solely on foreign policy. That he has not started a new war, even by the standpoint of recent presidents, has been a little bit less militaristic, albeit in a very clumsy way. And he says inflammatory things all the time. Right. And I'm not discounting that entirely because it is very important because the president has nearly unchecked power on this front. So
yeah, I would argue that it's almost by accident that he didn't start a war, but that's me.
That very well could be. And he hasn't, he said he would get the troops out of Afghanistan. I think we've just recently brought them back down to some lower level that had already been obtained a while ago. So if he's meeting some of his claims on this front, he would have done a lot better. If he was perhaps not so bad on so many other issues, this would be enough, I guess, to say this is better than the alternative. But this is hard to gauge because it's not policy oriented, but at the level Trump practices it, it does matter. The sheer amount of division he relentlessly pumps into our dialogue is just, it's not entirely his fault. He has a lot of willing participation from the other side as well, but he has not, and in the pandemic, he has failed so miraculously to even as I think he does many of the things that his advisors talk about, but then he backtalks them and undermines them in other ways. It's as chaotic and confused as you would expect from someone whose immediate background prior to this is reality television.
So you're saying he's not the 4D chess player?
No, absolutely not. I mean, he's perhaps a 4D chess player when it comes to his own image and catering a fanatical worship among his ever shrinking base of support. Not shrinking too dramatically. He still has, 35, 38% of the country that absolutely worships him. He's done a good job for cultivating his own brand, but no, in terms of broader political strategy, I don't believe it's there.
I will just say that I keep saying that, and I think that he's even better than people give him credit in cultivating his image, because in my mind, he has been so successful that he has made people numb to A, the infractions and shattering of norms, and B, his failures as an actual leader, that he is, in my opinion, converting some voters, people who are tired of some of the excesses on the left and have just grown so numb to the worst aspects of Trump that they start seeing him as a viable option. In fact, Vanessa and I just had a conversation with a friend, which surprised me.
In the last episode.
Yeah, in the last episode, it was just supposed to be kind of like just a cross-section for fun, talking to a friend about how crazy things are. And he ended up confessing he's a progressive and a liberal who confessed to have voted for Trump. And I've been thinking about this for a while, that I really do think that there is, I don't know if it's going to be, electorally meaningful, but a new kind of silent Trump voter who is the so tired, who is an elitist, who is an urbanite, who is not the Trump supporters that after 2016 you got on panels like the coal miner or the Warren Christmas Pennsylvania representative. It's people who agree on 99% of the Democratic platform, but have grown so alienated from what they see right now on the left that they're happy to support Trump as, a champion, just to punch back against their own house, their own tribe.
I mean, the excesses of the left, particularly on identity and cultural issues, have been a massive gift to the right in general. And I think if Trump was a little bit more savvy about this, he could have exploited it massively to his advantage. The problem is, honestly, Biden a little bit is a hard person to pin as the avatar of cancel culture, because he's just is a kind of moderate Democrat from an older iteration of the party. So Trump world has to claim that, well, Biden's going to be swept aside by this lefty tide, even though the kind of really hard left candidates did pretty bad in this Democratic primary. I think I think under a different matchup, this would be more of a thing. I mean, prior to the pandemic, I expected Trump to be reelected. I think things are so bad, and things being so bad are a reflection on the incumbent, even if whether it's his fault or not, I expect him to lose.
Really?
But,
I mean, I just, I feel like I keep bringing this point up with every person we're talking to. I just feel like the way that information gets transmitted today makes it so easy to completely separate reality from whatever it is that the politician represents within your internal narrative. So in reality, maybe people are dying by the hundreds of thousands from a pandemic, and the economy is terrible. And a lot of that is due to the mismanagement of federal government. And in theory, that would reflect poorly on the incumbent, right? But thanks to social media it's very easy to just box out all this discussion and draw people's attention to focus only on cancel culture. Cancel culture is a problem. Or Biden is going to be a sock puppet for the Sanderistas. I think the ability of people to create their own reality-shaping media silos is so big that the time of things like a pandemic or a bad economy truly shaping people's perspectives is over. We have too much control of the narratives that we're seeing and the way that it is shaping our politics.
The amount of, just the sheer amount of political polarization makes it so that any change, anything happening just has less of an effect because we're already so sorted. There's a smaller number than ever before of unsorted people or people who might switch from one to the other. So Trump's ceiling is lower, but the bottom floor, this tortured analogy, is higher. You know what I mean? There's less, like, no matter what he could, and he said this, right? The famous, I could shoot someone on whatever street it was in New York and I wouldn't lose any votes, has a ring of truth to it, and it's true for the other side. So, we're pretty split into these two camps. I mean, you could go back decades, right? And you would have people who would say they're Republicans, but they're voting for Democrats, and vice versa. You'd have Democratic governors of Republican states. You have it much to a lesser degree. And also the Republicans in Congress, the 10% most liberal of them would be more liberal than the most conservative Democrats. We've sorted all that out now. Not all of it, but most of it. Now everyone is where they should be. Everyone belongs to a tribe that fits what they think, or they've fitted what they think to the tribe they're part of. Either way, they're in the right place. I mean, systems get more efficient over time, like game systems where it's a contest to beat the other. Everybody eventually figures out how to play the game more efficiently, and that's largely what we've done. So you're right that there's not nearly as much movement as there would before. All that said, not everyone is so online as we are. There are still some I know people who are Trump voters who are not voting Trump, who were Trump voters and are voting Biden this time. I also know people the other way around. We're talking about the exodus of kind of the of higher, more educated voters from the Republican Party, white women from the Republican Party, but also the Republican Party's doing better with some minorities in some states now. So there are changes taking place. They're just not as pronounced or dramatic as you would have seen a decade ago.
I also wonder if people because we're so familiar with our left bubble and so familiar with the things that piss us off about the left, and like you said, we're sorted out, and so that's what we know. I do wonder what's happening on the other side, on the right side. Are they also fed up with what's going on their side, and could there be a similar movement away from their traditional politicians that they would go for because they're just sick of this online rhetoric? I know that, granted, with your point that not everyone is as online and plugged in as we are, but I do wonder if there could be a corollary on the other side.
Well, I mean, if Trump loses, right, there's going to be some kind of intellectual shakeup in the foundations of conservatism and what Republican voters think. There's going to be because many, I think, Republican leaders, politicians, think tank donor people were never really on board or were skeptical of some of the more populist Trump stuff. They want deregulation and tax cuts. And there's probably going to be an attempt to go back. And certainly some people are going to want to go back to a more traditional Republican agenda. Then other people will be, competing for the Trump populist mantle. Some of them might even have the last name Trump and we'll see where it's impossible to kind of tell how it's going to shake out. It's certainly going to be very interesting. So that's the kind of fight going on the right, which is it's among different issue coalitions, where I think the fight going on in the liberal side really is a fight between an ardent leftist, borderline democratic socialist and heavily identitarian or, very, pronouns and all those kinds of things, versus and that faction being much, much louder, but smaller. And then the bigger faction of just kind of older, moderate religious Democrats who chose Biden.
Well, not that I think the Republican Party needs my help, nor do I actually want them to take this advice. But from where I'm standing, it seems like it would be absolutely insane for the Republican Party to not put a more disciplined Trump in charge. Now, I think that will be a terrible thing for the country and the world. But I think Trump has shown that this is effective, and this is the strategy of slightly socialized nationalism is something, and populism is able to completely steal votes from disillusioned Democrats or just the alienated, forgotten voters of Middle America. And the problem with Trump is that he's completely lacking in discipline. They just need to get a better Viktor Orban, and that might be the end of America. But still, it's a good job for the Republican Party.
If Trump is reelected under these conditions, then obviously, yes, Trump is the greatest, most successful political Republican figure ever. He was smarter than everyone else, and you should copy him exactly, because these are really tough. This is a really tough situation he's up against. He's up against the most moderate and appealing rival he possibly could have had, someone who is just not disliked the way the last person he ran against was, and he's in a terrible spot, not for reasons that are not entirely beyond his control, but are just certainly to some degree beyond his control. So if he still pulls it out, it'll be a really amazing triumph for Donald Trump himself, to be honest.
Obviously, we're getting pulled into politics. It's hard not to. It's 2020 and it's a week before the election, but I do want us to talk about your book and the reporting that you did for book. So would you mind giving us a little bit of a, what are the...
Yes, did we introduce it? Panic Attack, Young Radicals in the Age of Trump. Excellent book.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to know what are these young radicals thinking?
Sure. So I noticed some of the themes, the incidents that probably you pay attention to as well, beginning on college campuses, right? In this last 10 years, the increasing illiberal tide in liberal activism on college campuses, mounting attempts to shout down speakers who are conservative or just depart from liberal thinking in maybe just one or two areas. For professors professors who are very liberal telling me that they are terrified of their students, that their students are going to report them for having said something wrong about race or sex or something that would have been perfectly fine in keeping with what progressives thought about these subjects in the 1970s, but has now fallen out of favor, or maybe just the language is wrong. Students shouting down speakers, other student groups, occasionally wielding violence to do so. Many of these incidents, have become known to a lot of people. What happened at Middlebury, Yale, the Claremont colleges, Mizzou, Evergreen. You go on and on with these things. So I visited some of these campuses. I talked to students at a lot more of them the student activists, to try to understand where these ideas are coming from and why they like these tactics. And my thesis of the book really is it about a new understanding of what safety entails, a broadening of the concept of safety to include safety from emotional harm. So many of these activists told me that they thought they were justified in preventing whoever it is, Ben Shapiro or Heather McDonald or Christina Hoff Sommers, or even their very liberal professor who said something that wounded them in some way. They're justified because if they feel hurt, if their feelings are hurt, or if a marginalized friend of theirs is hurt by this, it's like violence was wielded against them and they have the right to prevent it. Just the same as you would have the right to prevent, someone punching you in the face, you have the right to defend yourself. And that is the root idea that has taken hold. And then I would just add that I think what we've seen in the last few months or last years and even the last few months is an acceleration of this or a spreading of this kind of activism from the campus to online, to the workplace, to a lot of maybe pandemic era frustrations in the workplace spilling out onto social media. I think what happened at the New York Times with Barry Weiss is partly a reflection of this. Again, not to make everything media focused, but certainly the kind of woke young person who really thinks you've harmed them, you've compromised their safety if you say something they disagree with. That's not all young people at all. That's a small number of young people, but they're becoming more influential, and they move from the campus perhaps to an office near you.
Can I just ask a bit of a clarifying question on this, just to try and understand their perspective here? When they say that, emotional harm is is there the way that they're judging how people are allowed to act? Do they have a place where they draw the line? Like, is there anywhere where it would be like, well, it wasn't so hurtful, or maybe if somebody reacts disproportionately hurt to something that they don't deem as that so bad? Like, are there any kind of places where they can distinguish a good or bad action versus good or bad reaction?
That's a fantastic question. In my experience, I have been troubled by the lack of a limiting principle. And in fact, even some of the rules that prop up some of this on campus. So for instance, Title IX is the federal statute that prohibits gender-based discrimination and harassment in education. That has been marshaled by the activists to chill so much speech that any speech that offends you, that remotely impugns on sex or gender, could be a violation of Title IX. That's something activists claim. It's helped that, I mean, under the Obama administration, the Office for Civil Rights of the Education Department put out guidance that explicitly did not have these limiting principles in place, even where you would expect them to appear in harassment law. Usually in the workplace, it has to be severe, pervasive, offensive to an objection, to a reasonable, objective person. There's all these things that courts have recognized, so that just not all speech, not all negative interactions impugn some liability. The federal guidance was basically that any unwanted conduct of a sexual nature would be something that a university would have to investigate as a potential Title IX violation. I mean, that allows you to complain that your English professor talked about Shakespeare in a way you didn't like. Law professors have basically given up. At many elite institutions, they've given up even trying to teach how the law relates to sexual assault, because you could have someone in the class that is made uncomfortable by that discussion, and they've said it's better not to even try, which is, I think, an appalling outcome if the next generation of lawyers. I mean, think of the setback. I mean, the sort of the feminist legal movement, right, benefited from educating judges, prosecutors, potential juries about these aspects of the law that now we're shrinking from because, again, one student in a class of 20 might file a complaint.
To what extent does it really apply in the realm of quote unquote more harder sciences or engineering and things that like train you for real world vocations as opposed to the humanities? And that's not to dismiss the impact on the intellectual culture that we're in, but I'm just trying to see if there's a line there. Is it more I'm assuming that it's more predominant in the humanities or social sciences than it is in law, maybe psychology, etc.
Yeah, you're correct. Of course, it's wildly more prevalent in the humanities, the social sciences to some degree. I think, though, that there has been kind of an effort to, I think the hard sciences have been to some degree resistant to an effort to broaden their scope to include more of these kind of concerns about diversity and the thing. I mean, diversity obviously being a good thing, but has been used as a cudgel to inject some of these more activist ways of thinking into the disciplines. I think you see, these disciplines are they have people in them probably more who are more disproportionately more likely to really be trying to get maybe a craft or something out of it that they know translates to a good job. I mean, that certainly exists in the humanities as well. I'm a humanities major, but there are certainly more humanities graduates who took on tons of debt, who now are like not employable and probably think, where did I go wrong? It probably maybe even lends itself to a kind of lefty way of thinking, maybe even on economic issues, that there was injustice here. And to some degree there is injustice, right? People who were convinced by their evil academic advisors that it was worth going like $100,000 in debt to get the most fanciest English degree from the most fancy college, were liars and swindlers. So I have a great deal of sympathy for them on that front. The other thing I'll say on this, though, there's an effort to, I think, push these values into the K through 12 system as well. I mean, I saw the other day, I think it was Fairfax County again, which is the school district of Northern Virginia, the kind of suburbs that border DC. And they're not open for instruction because the teachers unions have refused to go back. Even all private schools are open now, but if you're a kid who relies on public education, you're in the terrible Zoom learning. They spent money. They spent like a lot of money to have a 1-hour instructional session for the principals and administrative people with Ibram X. Kendi, who is one of the noted anti-racist scholars of the summer, whose idea, which I think is very pernicious, his big idea is to amend the Constitution to create a Department of Anti-Racism that would explicitly be charged with sanctioning people for making racist statements. I mean, like a very fundamentally illiberal, contrary to kind of a First Amendment classical liberal approach, and that is being preached at to the administration of K through 12 schools. And it's so hard not to politicize education, but this seems to be moving in a bad direction of sort of instilling these kinds of values that I'm worried about, even not having them discussed the way they might be discussed in a college classroom, but just kind of required of the students, even from a very early age.
Okay, there's so much there that I want to take apart. So let's start with: do you agree that the problem that we should be focusing on is less the students themselves, but more the underlying institutional issue? The problem isn't that kids are energized about ideas like social justice, anti-racism. The problem is that the institutions that they go to are limiting their worldview and giving them a very narrow perspective as to what those concepts mean. And beyond that, those institutions that are supposed to educate the kids are actually making them less receptive to any idea that is in tension with this narrow worldview. Do you agree that this is the core problem?
Sort of. I mean, the problem is that these are being taught not as sort of ideas that one can. So they're not even really being taught in the sense of like, here's a college classroom where like, here's what conservatism is, here's what liberalism is. Let's talk about that. It's more they are the rules, and if you don't follow them, you could be subject to some kind of penalty. It's not because it's not the faculty who has adopted this by and large. There's some faculty members obviously who believe in this, but it's the administrators kind of enforcing it, even sometimes student residential people. Again, if we're talking about the college environment, it's more like you must sign on to the idea that diversity is good, and also that if you're not providing if you're not manifesting diversity, you might be guilty of a legal violation because the law requires a safe, equitable educational environment or work environment or harassment-free environment. My philosophy also says that emotional comfort is just the same as physical comfort. There's all these. It's what I think. It's what is like required under the existing law. Is the view of this? The administrators are saying you have to sign on to this. So it's a meeting of the fact that there are some small number of young people who believe this and want to enforce it, and then there's an apparatus for it to be enforced. And even though probably most people or a significant number of people are like would not sign on to it willingly otherwise.
Right, but if we're to assign blame, kids having simple worldviews is nothing new. It's rather the fault of the administrators and faculty for not challenging it.
Yes, I agree with that. Yes, I agree.
So one of the earliest encounters that I had with this issue was, I think, in 2013. I was talking to a professor in an Ivy League school who was speaking for his friend, and I'm not going to give details because I actually don't have permission to report on it, but the friend was an English professor, and he was teaching one of those foundational texts in European history. And that text, one of those pieces that I think it's considered one of the earliest narrative novels, and it includes a story of a rape and power relations between a servant and a master. The piece itself is actually revolutionary when you think about it, like written, I think, 300 years ago as depicting the exploitative and corrosive nature of power relations, of class, of wealth disparities. And this is radical content for 300 years ago. But then one student complained to the administrators that, hey, there's rape there, and this professor is teaching us about rape. And you can imagine how the story unfolds. They go before the administrators, the teacher has to stand before a panel, and this is 2013, so it's in the early stage of what you call the panic. There were no stories in Vox about it, or no counter stories in Fox. It just happened in real time. And he goes before the panel, and the panel says, Professor, you're in the right, but you need to stop teaching this text. This text that is one of the cornerstones of European literature. The insane thing here is not the kid saying it, is an administrator saying, there was a kid with a stupid opinion who misunderstood the text, who exactly needs an English professor to tell them, you're wrong. Here's why you're wrong. Here's why this text is so important. Here's why, if you're going to study literature, you need to understand this text. Here's how you need to read this text. And here's how, through this text, you can observe the evolution of human perception. Instead, you're getting administrators saying, no, stop that. Stop teaching this text. And instead, you need to pander to your students as if you're a politician or an entertainer. And this is where the problem is. This is where the adults should have said enough and didn't, and instead validated every single puerile complaint that came their way.
Well, and there's a lot of validators. There's the increasing. There's so many more administrators in schools on college campuses than ever before. It increases every year. The ranks of the faculty salaries have not increased, whatsoever, probably the entire time I've been alive. Meanwhile, university after university, they'll double the number of administrators they have, the ratio of administrators to other people. There's more cops. When there's more cops, there's more enforcement. There's someone you can go to have your grievance legitimated, especially because these people, these are people in charge of the residence halls that have, they have titles like Vice President of Sustainable, Happy Student Engagement in Life. Like, what is their job? And these people draw massive salaries, just scandalously high salaries. They absolutely have that established. These are north of 100K. The University of Michigan, where I graduated from, I think they have, I don't remember the exact statistic. They had dozens of people in these kinds of positions making this kind of money. And what is this person's job but to make a student feel happy and safe and comfortable, to make their lives less difficult, more difficult for the professors. So the professors, just coming in, and so even if most of these people are reasonable, there's always some of these people who are just who prioritize compliance with bizarre rules rather than a culture of free inquiry and free speech, even if it's difficult, because free speech is difficult. It's difficult to have uncomfortable conversations. It's difficult to foster the kind of conditions where people feel free to express heretical ideas without shaming, and you have productive dialogues about it. It's much easier to even accidentally, even if you're not trying to do it on purpose, have a snitch culture and a compliance culture, a culture where you go straight to the panel for adjudicating student grievances to have your perspective heard, to file some kind of complaint.
The way this plays out for me is we're talking about a completely different set of incentives. So if we look at a world, what we imagine the academic world is supposed to be, the fantasy academic world, which is promoting free inquiry, debate, free speech. And on the other hand, you have the administrative incentive, which is we are creating a valuable membership card for the American elite, which costs $200,000. And that's it. We just need to make sure that people still want to buy this membership card and to keep on advertising it. What we certainly don't care about is what values happen to get slipped into the process of gaining this membership card. Just so long as people from the US or abroad still come here and pay $200,000 to get it. So how do you actually reconcile this? If at the core of it, there is no incentive for administrators to actually uphold what you and I, and presumably Vanessa, see as the core values of academic learning.
Yeah, I mean, right. There are so many problems with exactly what you're describing. It's hard to know what exactly to do about it. I have been such a skeptic of the value of higher education, given the cost to the individual students. Obviously, the cost being just wildly distorted by a number of things. I think the government subsidizing student loans is a suspect policy. Obviously, it has a good intention to make it easier for students to pay this kind of cost. But if you're distorting the price, that we've seen, and there have been numerous studies who have shown this. So there's some evidence for this claim. It's not like just some like crazy right-wing claim that the subsidizing the loans gives the universities every incentive, every reason to just raise the price because the government is going to help you pay it. And you don't even know what you're paying. It's years later, you're going to figure it out. It just kind of seems free to you right now. And this just has this massive distorting effect. I mean, I think public universities that are truly supported by the taxpayers of their state, that would be an issue where, like, even as a libertarian, I wouldn't have a problem for the state legislatures putting some rules on how much they can raise the actual price. I'm from Michigan. It seems to me a little crazy that the universities in Michigan, that Michigan State, University of Michigan, are like unaffordable to people who live there, whose tax money does go to support it. That seems kind of wrong to me. I think what could be the case is that the pandemic, which really, I mean, is wreaking havoc on every facet of life and is a once in a century tragedy, might have people correctly rethinking the value versus the cost of higher education. I think every university is choosing a slightly different path. I think some are lowering the cost. I mean, it's totally unreasonable and insane to charge the same thing for this terrible, awful experience. What a lot of the wealthy are paying for when they go to college is, we know it. It's the experience. It's the fun. It's the party. That's sad, but it's true. That's the message from the college admission scandal, right? None of these kids had any concern that they would fail out because they're actually not smart enough to be there. Of course they can get by, and they were willing to pay an astronomical amount of extra money to get into the one they wanted because it'd be more fun there and it's slightly more prestigious. An absolute scandal. So there is an opportunity to rethink higher education a little bit right now, but obviously it's very.
I just think that the place where it gets rethought is maybe in mid-level schools, but probably in the higher schools, like in the Ivy League, and definitely places like Harvard and Yale. They're fine. They're still charging their $65,000 a semester for online courses. Because not only that, I spoke to some professors in that field, that some of the things that administrators are doing is actually just opening up the waiting list a little bit and telling people you're in, and people who are already going to go to a mid-level school somewhere. And it's like, oh, cool, I got into Harvard. I am going to pay those $60,000 because I think beyond the experience is, like I said, it's the membership card. And for people still buying into the idea that Harvard is your ticket for success or for, climbing up socially, it's just maybe it's worth it in their mind, those $200,000.
Right. And it might be worth it if you have vast financial resources. It might be worth it. The question is it worth it if you put yourself into debt for years after, when you could have gotten the exact same education? I mean, the next 100 colleges, I don't believe the difference in the educational quality to Harvard is nearly as the gulf is not there relative to the price. But of course,
that's what I'm saying. The education quality is meaningless. Yeah. That's exactly my point. They don't actually care about the professors, and I think that's going back to the problem that we were talking about. I think the professors, the faculty, is actually the least important part of the equation. They're the customer is the parents or the students, depends on how you look at it. The merchant is the administrator, obviously, selling a diploma. And the merchants are just facilitators. They're just completely interchangeable. And that's why their salaries have been so stagnant, as you pointed out yourself. Anyway, that's just all that was just an intro to the question. If you agree with me that this is part of or a core element of the problem that is like fostering this culture of coddling, why aren't we talking about this more? Because a concern that I get when I'm trying to convince people that cancel culture is a real problem and that it does have miasmic effect to the rest of society, I find myself having to explain time and time again exactly why students doing crazy things in college matters. And the response to this is always, those are just kids being in their little social justice subculture in college. It doesn't mean anything. Get over yourselves. They're just being jerks. So part of my regular response is, first, if we don't like these behaviors in college, we're not going to like them when they come out of college. But the bigger point for me is that the problem, again, is not the kids. This is a problem that is endemic to the institutions of higher education.
Yeah. To respond to so I absolutely get it. People accuse me of this all the time. You're just bashing, idiotic college students. Is that really fair? And also, it's now because, college student writes a stupid newspaper op-ed. It's around forever. It will spread on social media. It might become a story on Fox News. 20 years ago, they would have written it. No one would have seen it. That would have been the end. So it can seem like I do think the problem's getting worse, but there's so much more coverage of the problem that it makes it look that much even worse than it actually is. I have tried to be more careful when I report on stupid college students doing stupid things. I have tried to become more careful about thinking about, okay, should I actually escalate this? Should I actually call this to the attention of my audience? Is there a way I can do so without subjecting the individual students to personal stigma or shame? Can I not name them? Can I talk about them in some general way? I've tried to do that more. Now, if it's the student body president who came out with a statement about how this professor should be run off campus, then probably I'm going to name them. I'm going to use their statement. But if it's just a student commenting on that statement saying, yes, run them off campus, I'm probably not going to screenshot it. I'm probably not going to share their name. Because part of the problem with cancel culture, right, is not allowing for people to be forgiven. So it would be wrong if those of us who are concerned about cancel culture to then go out and try to destroy the lives of the people who are doing the things we don't like. I think what often trips people up, though, is also that the most prominent victims of cancel culture tend to look less sympathetic, just in the sense that, so when Chappelle gets in trouble or something, the comedian Dave Chappelle, then there will be a news cycle about how people tried to cancel Dave Chappelle. But Dave Chappelle is, and I'll probably agree that the trying to cancel him was dumb or something, but also he's a famous comedian. He's going to be fine. He might even, spin this into something beneficial for him because he's controversial. We don't talk about as much, the truck driver who was photographed doing this, and someone said it was a white nationalist hand gesture, and he lost his job and he can't get it back, and now he's in poverty or homeless.
To our listeners, Robby just did the OK sign.
Yeah, I'm done. But see, I'll be fine because I'm a prominent enough critic of cancel culture. I could start my own podcast or something. But the common people who just get tripped up, who cannot follow the ever mutating, ever changing demands of the most progressive people on what pronouns to use, what hand signals are okay. I mean, they're often insane and conspiratorial requirements, or ones reflecting a conspiratorial mindset. Those people, it happens to them all the time. And you don't, you only hear about it if they're in touch with a journalist, if they know how to find me, and I'll tell their story. But that kind of thing happens a lot. So finding and talking about those kinds of stories, I think, makes people maybe more or less likely to fall into, well, you're just like bashing students, or you're just defending the already rich and powerful or something.
But even when you feel like the story does deserve to be covered, isn't there a concern that we're not focusing on what the core problems are, whether it's the administrative issues or the economic incentive problems that we talked about? And with the case of the truck driver losing his job, that's a Twitter problem with platforms like Twitter designed to amplify the worst nature of human tribalism. And in all those cases, the problem isn't the people who are participating in the quote unquote canceling, because that's just part of human nature to want to find a witch to hunt. The problem is the people who are supposed to be the adults in the room who aren't stepping up to moderate this behavior. But at the same time, I'm saying this, I'm already giving myself chills because who the hell do I want moderating this? In the case of Twitter, for instance, I definitely don't want Congress, Republicans or Democrats overruling Section 230,
which they're talking about in the hearing today.
Exactly.
I was watching it before I came on. Yeah, I mean that. So I'm actually I'm writing another book right now about social media and attempts to regulate it. So problems people have with social media and then the proposed solutions, and that is an issue. So I agree with. So some of the criticism of social media, I firmly reject. A lot of the kind of tech addiction stuff that is prevalent in the Social Dilemma film smacks of moral panic to me.
Yes.
You know, we were told this about comic books, violent video games, etc.
Come on, Robby, put your phone in a cookie jar.
Yeah, no. One moment you're looking at your phone, the next Pete Campbell from Mad Men is in your head, forcing you to do
three
things.
Pete Campbells.
Three versions of him. So some of the concerns are just really overblown. But there are problems with social media. But then the question becomes, what's the solution? And so many solutions on the table. Like right now, conservatives are so mad about bias on social media. They think they're unfairly targeted by the tech platforms. You can point to evidence where bad calls were made. I think what Twitter and to some degree Facebook did with the New York Post Hunter Biden story is really hard to defend. And in fact, they agree pretty much because Jack Dorsey said this was a bad call.
Oh, we effed up.
At the same time, like the proposal on the table to get rid of Section 230. This is so both sides want to do this essentially for opposite reasons. It would not if you got rid of the
for listeners who are not necessarily policy attentive. Can you just give a summary of what the 230 debate is?
Yeah, Section 230 is a federal law, is a statute that gives immunity, it gives a liability shield to tech platforms for content posted on their site. So basically says that Facebook is not going to be held liable if I post a defamatory comment on Facebook. Or libelous, you can sue me. You can't sue Facebook. Now, if I publish a defamatory book or article in the New York Times, you can sue the New York Times and you can sue the book publisher in addition to me. This is a special protection for Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, platforms that are so vast that they can't do the kind of like fact checking, or they're not where the law is saying. So this is a law, so it can be changed, it could be debated. The point of the law is to say they're not really responsible in the same way my book publisher is responsible for me.
And it's a protection from 1996 that has basically established the internet as we know it today.
Right, because you couldn't have anything going on. So if Facebook could be sued for the thing you post, that you write in a post, I mean, you can imagine how this falls apart very quickly. They might have to vet your comment ahead of time, or they might have to vet you and be someone you could be trusted to post at will. So it's kind of insane that conservatives have come up with the idea, well, we'll get rid of this, because the obvious result would be increased moderation for like the kind of edgy right-wing content that they're already mad isn't prevalent enough on the site. So it's more just a strategy to really like hurt and punish these companies for behaving in a way that conservatives don't like, that wouldn't at all address the issue. So on the other side, Democrats, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, they also want to get rid of Section 230 because they think Facebook and Twitter, mostly Facebook, allow too much bad, edgy, wrong content. So they want to force them to do, in a nutshell, they want to force these companies or punish them for failing to do enough moderation. And the Republicans say there should be less moderation. And
supercharging it, at least from the left, is a concern about monopolies and big tech.
Yeah, then there are some kind of almost more traditional or more familiar, just monopoly concerns about how big and how anti-competitive nature. Right now, there's a law, a DOJ investigation into Google about that's more on that. So conservatives were all excited about this, but then I read the text of the investigation, and it has nothing to do with any of the conservative grievances. It is solely about the potential anti-competitiveness of Google.
Well, it doesn't matter as long as they can sell it as to their voters as action against.
Right, but it matters to me because I understand the grievance. I think some of I think there is some evidence of bias. At least, like I think what Twitter did with the New York Post story was really bad. I'm open to ideas to address that policy, and though I'm a libertarian, I guess I would even consider like a regulatory reaction. But just just a regulatory effort that is just going to punish these companies and not even address that problem. So that I will absolutely oppose, because I oppose regulation on its own.
It has become a maxim for me that if something has bipartisan support, it's probably a bad idea.
Yes. Yes. Well, and just with the kind of monopoly argument for these companies, so right, I'm trying to be reasonable. I see the argument for why Google might be a monopoly, and I think some of their behavior maybe fits into that framework a little bit more. I have a hard time really seeing like Facebook as a hard M monopoly, because like, what is it going to do with that power? For antitrust, there has to be some harm to the consumer. Like they can suddenly jack up the price or something, but you're not charging for Facebook for the user. And I know they're very big and very powerful, and I guess they could buy rival companies, but it's hard for me to imagine. It's impossible for like a rival like photo sharing thing to be, you know what I mean? It's just, I don't see as much the concern. I mean, they compete with Twitter to some extent. Amazon, I guess, is a monopoly, but no one is. It's just so great that you get free stuff, that you get much cheaper stuff so easily. So some of these, I see the concern with Google.
I got into an argument with a socialist-leaning friend about Google specifically, which I wonder what you see as the concern, because when I was arguing about Google's ultimate power, I thought like, if you want, you can always like opt out and use Bing. Nobody's stopping you. Or there are other email services. There are other. And then one of the responses of my friends were something along the line of, yeah, but it's so integrated and convenient that I don't want to leave. So you're saying it's free, it's too convenient, and that's a problem.
Right.
I really don't think that's what antitrust laws were meant to combat. So help me see what I'm missing, which is funny. I'm asking a libertarian. And there's definitely the ad problem, I guess.
That, and also kind of restricting the ecosystem for littler players. Like, how can you if you're a young tech startup, how are you going to get a foot in the door when everything is really kind of owned already? And I assume that I'm less well versed in this.
I don't know, but
I believe that's part of it.
Zoom only recently became a juggernaut, and it's in the digital world, it's a lot easier for small competitors just by the nature of the beast. You're not fighting over material in the ground. It's not the same conditions that prompted the antitrust laws of the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. I mean, the product is ephemeral to some degree. It's not like we have all the oil reserves, so how could anyone ever have more oil reserves than us? I mean, like, dude, I mean, I'm old enough to remember MySpace and AOL Instant Messenger, and like things come and go. Kids are really into TikTok. For a while it was Snapchat. Right? Like it seems for the tech market, there's some kind of intrinsic, like something new comes along to a greater degree.
And Facebook was only founded about 15 years ago. It's not HP that existed from the 30s.
Well, and if you look at the top 10, the top 10 tech companies every year, like, they've over the last 15 years, they've gone up and down all the time. So it seems like you could have a competitor come on. There will be shakeups. There are things that make them not monopolistic like that. And also, they're not really wielding their power in an anti-consumer monopolistic way, because we like this stuff, basically. So that's why it seems premature to we got to kill them for this reason. The other thing, though, with like the Section 230 changes and everything, so Zuckerberg finally said, he's like, okay, I think he said this today, all right, we're open to this being changed, but keep this in mind: the more regulatory barriers you impose, more liability you inflict, that's just going to like hurt. If there was a competitor to come along, you would just kill them off in their infancy, because they can't hire a team of lawyers to deal with these things. Right. So this is kind of a classic libertarian criticism of regulation, but I think it holds a lot of merit in many cases, including this one, where you would just...
Yeah, it's a super important point. Can you expand on it a little bit?
Yeah. So they so if you impose you change Section 230, so there's more liability costs. They have to do more to make sure speech is not libelous. They have to do all this stuff. They have to hire lawyers. Well, Facebook is in a position to do that, whereas some competitor coming along might not have the resources to do it. So you're hurting Facebook, but you're hurting people who would compete against them theoretically even more. So then you're actually not hurting Facebook, you're helping them.
And it's partially as if you're tailoring the regulations to fit the size of the current company, and they're kind of grandfathered into it.
Or basically they have the resource. It's more like they have the resources to adapt to it in a way, like, which is kind of happening in Europe with GDPR, like in that way, where the bigger companies are the ones that like have the teams of lawyers that can figure out how to adapt, and it's the little guys that have just like sometimes you'll get those alerts on your screen like, hey, we've shut down because we have to figure this out and we can't keep going without it, which is not the case with bigger companies.
And I just know it as a truism of libertarian thought that being declared utility is kind of the dream of a company. It's not something that they're afraid of.
And Facebook, hires thousands and thousands and thousands of people to do this job. Many of them coming straight from the government. I can't tell you how many of Facebook's top, and Twitter and all these companies, the top VP making decisions on this front is a former Kamala Harris staffer or Joe Biden staffer or something. So they have so much more access to a knowledge of the regulatory regime. I mean, this is a classic libertarian criticism of so many things, but it's been like that a little bit with campaign finance reform, where we're saying, look, I get what you're talking about, but the wealthier, more connected, savvier political entities know how to game all these rules. They know who enforces them. They know how to do it. So while you're trying to keep money out of politics, what you're really just doing is like punishing people who would want to break into it, rather than actually, everyone who wants to get away with spending it. They know what's the 501c whatever status, if we funnel it into a PAC or whatever, or my wife can donate it instead or something, they figure it out, and it just ends up kind of hurting the little guy.
So we're coming close to our out time. So just one little question. As a libertarian, how do you solve crony capitalism?
One simple question. Right. So I mean, unsurprisingly, I tend to think we need a smaller government, because the drive to capture the government, or to capture the regulators, or to own the regulators themselves gets even more important if there's more regulating to be done. Obviously, we need, I'm not an anarchist. We need regulation for true, what do they call public goods issue, environmental issues, that kind of thing. Although even in some of those, there's room for property rights to actually protect environmental resources. If you give local people more feeling like it's their stuff, you don't get a tragedy of the commons kind of situation. I think in general, I think clear, transparent, simple rules are better than complicated commissions doing open-ended investigations run by political figures. With the tech companies, for instance, I could probably the line along which I think Section 230 could potentially be updated would be some kind of privacy consideration for keeping, I think for instance, courts, maybe the Supreme Court has struck down revenge porn laws stopping that kind of thing. So you could change a law social media tech has given us a much greater ability to violate people's privacy and then have that out there forever in just a very harmful way. So I might like to see, that might be an area where I think you could have legislation improve upon, I guess, what the natural state of what the market allows. But again, I'd be very careful that I didn't bring down the whole internet as I did it, which is not necessarily something you can ever trust regulators to do.
Yeah, and that, in addition to the growing bipartisan fervor to limit undesired expression, could be really opening Pandora box there.
Right.
So, final question, closing the circle from the beginning. What are you most worried about going into November 3rd and the elections?
I'm most concerned about the pandemic, that we're going to continue to kind of just be in a holding pattern of restrictions, and then things get a little bit better, and then we lift them, and then they get bad again. I'm hopeful that I think there's been pressure from the media. I mean, I think this is part of the anti kind of Trump side bias. There's been pressure to portray things as very bad and by the media, and that Trump is responsible. Whereas if Trump is no longer president, I'm interested to see if there's less focus on how utterly horrible everything is. Will CNN's second by second COVID death rate stay on the screen? I'm not sure. So I'm very interested to see how the media covers the admittedly bad situation, but if it's as just constantly in your face as it has been for the last few months.
Robby, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
If you're ever in New York, let me get you a beer.
Absolutely. I hope to be there again soon.
In a non-socially distant era. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. This episode was kind of a breather compared to the previous one. Our next episode, if everything goes well, will be on November 4th. So, yeah, brace yourselves. If anything remains, please sign up to uncertain.substack.com or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a nice rating, and we'll see you next time. Stay sane.